Good day, everybody, and welcome to week one of Analytical Figure Drawing at CGMA. I'm running this class in the way that I sort of came into this class. This class was called Analytical Figure Drawing, and it covers a lot of structural anatomy, and it explains or combines that structural anatomy with the construction shapes that we use in figure construction. So in theory, this class is actually analytical figure drawing plus figure construction. And what we're going to be doing, as this class has done in the past, is we're going to be doing studies of the anatomical structure of the human form. So we're going to be doing écorchés, so to speak, where we take the skin off of the model and we only look at the underside of it, the bones, the tendons, the muscles, and we put them in an order and we put them in a grouping. Then we contain it or put the skin back on, and we look at it as an artist using design shapes to help construct a figure. By simplifying the body down into construction shapes, it makes anything easier to draw because we then connect with the language of the artist, which is shape, value, line, edge, form, and so forth. We can equate those to some of those to design elements, which again brings me back to the language of art. So that's what we are. We are artists speaking a language. Pictures are communication tools in some way, shape, or form. Even if we're just getting something out of our own head, we're still communicating with ourselves. We need an alphabet, and we need some way of putting the alphabet together to form words, or in this case, pictures that form words to describe something, whatever that description may be. In this case, we're going to be doing descriptions of an anatomical design, how the body is constructed, how it works, and the layering or the construction process in how we put it together, where the muscles attach to the bones, a brief description of their function, but more importantly, the analysis of shape design so that we can then use that for our dialogue that we're trying to create. So with that being said, I would like to cover a few definitions here in the very beginning of class, and then towards the end I'm going to do a couple demonstrations just to get you started on what your first assignment's going to be in breaking the figure down and turning it into a mannequin, something of a template that you can then work on top of to put all of your musculature and all the other anatomical study that we're going to be doing on top of this, what I'm going to also call scaffold. So your mannequin is a scaffold of sorts. It's the armature or the frame that holds it all together. Now, in sculpture, an armature is the metal wire that is under the clay. In our case, it's going to be a container that we put things inside of. So in the armature, what we're doing is we're designing with shape, complex shapes, the skeleton, that become simple translations, the mannequin, that we can then build on top of. This anatomy stuff is insanely crazy, and unless you have a handle on construction as far as like solid shapes are concerned, if we translate the anatomy with no kind of constructed shapes in that that study, we don't really understand how we're going to be able to use this information and exaggerate it. So what I mean by that is, if we go into, let's say, animation for a moment, we speak in terms of animation. You have squash and stretch, anticipation and overshoot, which is attached to squash and stretch. And all of that is dynamic form in motion, recoil and snap out, and all of these different actions that we're creating to intensify the activity. We have to do that in the body in some way. And we can think of the body as a pliable, like a gummy surface, and we can stretch it out. But to know the body and understand what is stretching and what is squishing and what is compressing and what is pulling and so forth, it gives more weight and believability to our animations. The same thing applies to illustration. If we're making a picture, especially in an illustration, in-betweens of an animated sequence sometimes don't work as pictures because they're a little confusing, because they're in between key frames or major silhouettes that describe an action. If we build the body in an illustration in one of those in-between moments, somewhere between the key moments, it might not favor the action. By understanding the construction of the body, we can then exaggerate certain parts of the body to help reinforce the action in hopes that it helps translate the body even more, or translate the pose even more for the viewer. So when we're learning all of this information, we're learning it sort of like a book. We're building an anatomy book. We're putting a bunch of pictures together that have muscles and bones in them, so we can see how the body works underneath. And more importantly, when we're using reference or we're using a live model, we understand all of the changes of value on the surface of the body, the graying halftones, the colors that look greenish to us sometimes under certain lighting conditions. Knowing that there's no green in the body, heaven forbid, that what would that green color be? Oh, that must be a shadow, right? And we misinterpret a lot of that information on the human form. In photography, those colors might appear, but more importantly, what they become in a photo is just a different value of the flesh tone. Anything that changes value to a newbie or a beginner tend to think of those areas as shadows instead of halftones or midtones, and shade them too dark. So this anatomy stuff helps us look at the human form and say, I get what's going on over there. Those halftones or shadows are muscles underneath, and the skin covers them, but covers them in a way where now they're not like my anatomy book anymore, but there's still like a design to each section of the body. And when I understand that design more clearly, those darks and middle values make more sense. I can then translate my drawing or make a better drawing using the tools I understand, making a convincing picture with a lot of detail in it, because we like a lot of detail, right? No, but what I mean in that way is that we can actually put muscles between the two lines of the silhouette of the figure in confidence, knowing that we're going to put them in a location that they fit into, and we can then model their action to describe a stronger animation of action. So with that said, let's cover some of those definitions now. Some of the things you're going to be doing are exaggeration and elimination. And what I mean by elimination is that you're going to be taking things away to start your drawing. We don't start with every detail. We start with a generalization. In the figure, we have to generalize spaces, which means that all the lumps and the bumps on the contour are disregarded, but the direction that the limbs are moving in, that's what we focus on now. We focus on the movement of the entire body. So in context to what I'm saying, we're looking at the skeleton. We're looking deep underneath. We're looking through the skin, through the muscles, down into the core. And when we draw that out, we're going to be drawing it with simplified shapes, taking all those muscles away to begin with, and we'll apply those later on. I'm going to show you in the demonstrations, both the mannequin and the mannequin with the muscles on it, and a drawing without using the mannequin and just working with the muscles. And I'm going to try and describe what's going on in all three, so that you get an idea of why this mannequin is going to be very useful for this class. It's what I tend to use in my anatomy classes because it just gives us a really strong structure underneath that doesn't have too much over exaggeration to it in the way that an animator would use the animation puppets that we've seen in books for a long time, with the little circular joints between each limb of the arms and the legs and so forth. This has a little more solidity to it. We're looking at the construction and the welding of the corners and not the movement of the corners as of yet, because we're going to be building things in those spaces, and we want clean spaces that we can make strong connections with, which is why we use this mannequin. So the first thing we realize when we have to look at the body and try to simplify it into a shape that we don't really see is that we have to use what we do see in order to help us. So an implied line of action is something that our eyeball connects together between different shapes in space, and this is what helps us compose pictures or create actions within the figure. So the implied line of action, as each object is drawn, the implied line is a broken edge that seems to draw itself from one object to the next, giving the illusion that it was originally a solid pathway for the eye. Now, that might sound a little confusing. Hopefully this picture will explain what I'm speaking about. When we get to this side of these shapes, we certainly have a pathway that we're moving along, but it's a bumpy pathway. We move in and out of forms quite a lot. But up here, there seems to be this seamless transition between all of these shapes, as if they were all once connected together. An illustrator or an artist of any sort using 2D or even 3D for that matter, sculptors use this for everything, harmonizing the entire form. In fact, well, let me explain this. Every artist that I know uses this to some degree because it creates harmony amongst the pieces. But if you think about the human form and all the muscles in each part of the body, muscles are lumpy and bumpy, but when we move them, they all pull or push together in the same direction. They all compress or stretch in the same direction. So it's like a chorus or an orchestra all playing together in harmony with one. And your muscles are going to do that. They are going to build an implied direction or an implied pathway. So this is how we simplify the figure. This is also how we make the figure feel more harmonious from top to bottom, from head to toe, from side to side, without the body looking so radical that it actually ends up looking something similar to the Michelin Man. And I wish I had an example of him if you don't know who he is. He's a tire company mascot, and he's made up of inflated donuts that are all kind of stacked on top of one another, and it looks like an accordion when you look at him from afar. And we don't want the body to feel that way. We don't want the body to feel like you can squeeze it down into a little box. We want the body to feel sturdy, but we also want the actions to feel lively. This other tool we have called the abstraction. If you haven't heard of the abstraction before in that context, you might have heard of it as the Riley method, or let's bring that word back, the Riley abstraction. What this basically means is that there was a guy who made up a thing that wasn't really his because it already existed all the way back into the 14th century, in fact, but it was a carried down tradition or a tool to help sculptors at the time and to help tapestry makers design the human body so that it became a tool of paths and implied line directions. Because way back in the day, when architects were building, they were also the sculptor and the painter, and they're creating this thing that has this harmony to it, and all things within a temple, for example, work together in harmony. So when you walk inside of it, nothing stands out over anything else. You feel comfortable within the crazy mess of all the rococo that's going on around you, the insane filigree on the walls and in the corners and around the mullions of the windows and so forth. But all of that was harmonized with these implied pathways and shape design or geometry that held each space in place captive, but then also connected it to all the other spaces. This invisible boundary that linked everything together, including paintings. And an artist named Dean Cornwell had an assistant named Frank Riley. And if you've heard of Dean Cornwell, he's a pretty badass illustrator and muralist. He went over to study with a guy named Frank Brangwyn, who was also another badass, who had a connection with this ancient language because he was making stained glass windows and tapestries and rugs and everything under the sun that required some kind of tool or mechanism to make everything feel like it fits together. He was really good at murals. Dean Cornwell knew this, and so he went and studied with him and found the missing link, which was this tool. It's an abstract tool, but it helps pull it all together and make a harmony out of a bunch of individual shapes and individual actions, possibly, if we're talking murals and reliefs that have a lot going on within them. Again, remember, these are language tools, so these implied pathways help the viewer link sentences together or spaces together to help form an idea. And so with this abstraction tool, then, we're linking parts together, not just along a contour, but through the form as well, from one side to the other. So if we look at this arm, for example, we have muscles above and below, but it was designed through the form, linking things together in pathways. So as we learn a little more about our construction shapes, what I also bring to this type of class is the abstraction. I've studied, I think, pretty much every method of figure drawing, and I'm finding that there are certain tools that just really love one another, and they work really well together. It's kind of like finding the perfect martial art form, like Bruce Lee was trying to do. He was trying to bring together a bunch of different art forms, fighting forms, and create a perfect fighting form, an indestructible fighting form, so to speak. And that's what I'm kind of trying to do, and I'm hoping that all the other teachers that contribute to this class as well are doing the same thing. We're all adding little pieces to this pie called the figure and helping you understand there's a lot of ways to go about building the figure. There's a lot of different tools and disciplines to designing the figure and rendering the figure and so forth. And what we're looking for here are maybe a combination of those tools that make it easy for us to draw anything, anywhere, anytime without needing specific stuff like a fancy art table or certain templates like T-squares or whatever. We can use a sketchbook. We can draw lines in the sand and we can make a picture if we needed to. But we have these tools that allow us, not allow us necessarily, but give us the confidence to go ahead and make a picture because we know how to. So now coming back to this abstraction, the abstraction is another method on top of construction and on top of analyzing, for that matter. But the combination of all of them will make it feel like they all belong together. So by the end of this class, you'll have several methods for not only putting the figure together and grouping things, but also to help what I kind of call massage the shapes into each other so that they build harmony in your picture. They link things together and make things feel like all those things belong together and move together as a group, as a gestalt. All the muscles are forming one particular action and they're all supporting that action. That's partially how this abstraction works, is it brings it all together. Figure construction is an ensemble of design shapes that simplify the complexity of human anatomy, like a shorthand for the easy translation of a pose, an action, or a movement. What that means is that we take a whole bunch of stuff and we can turn it into something more tangible, or more along the lines of what we need in terms of what I mean by tangible, because these are tangible too. We have a radish, 2 drinking cups, and a drumstick. But those shapes together are the spaces of muscles that we think about in the way that the shape design of the muscle or the grouping of muscles create another ideal symbol, or a symbol in general. And those symbols are basically the understructure for all this other complex stuff that sits on top that we know now as shadow patterns and halftones. My apologies, I'm for some reason almost coughing every couple of moments. So when you hear me kind of chuckling, it's really me trying to prevent a cough in the microphone. The shadow patterns that we were talking about earlier, the halftones that we were questioning, the grays and the darker values, that's what all these little hatch lines are. If you think of these hatch lines as patches, this whole space right here is a patch. This entire space right along in here is a patch, a curving triangular patch. If you think of them as patches, then they become spaces, or certain planes, if you will. Inside of here, there's several planes happening, and there's usually a shadow covering them all. So we can't really say this is a path, but we can definitely say it's a shape. When you squint your eyes, all that detail inside of that shadow flattens out, and all you see is the boundary shape of that shadow, which is what I'm speaking about here. The hatch lines that I'm drawing have to do with direction. They're helping the eye hopefully form a stronger understanding of the volumes that we see here. Now, this was just thrown together as an example, so I wasn't like in Zen mode thinking about every shape exactly. So there's a few here, like up in the deltoid, that don't necessarily harmonize with the form. It's just where I know the form to start to darken in certain conditions. But if I'd really put my mind to it, I could have wrapped those lines around the form more convincingly and build out a much stronger volume. So we go like this, we go like this, we go like this, then maybe like that. Up here we go like this. Down here it starts to get more complex as it transitions into other muscle groups. But now you can see that the lines that I have just drawn are starting to reinforce a volume of sorts, although they're contradicting some of the other volumes I just realized. So let me get those out of there and maybe go this way with them. Now all things feel a little better in context to one another. Right, so line is a tool that we're going to use a little bit of, but figure construction is a concept of basic shapes and how those shapes can build out and create the human body. We use these basic shapes just to lay out the space where the details are going to go. And the details, what I'm going to say right now about the word detail is a personal, little personal statement here, but I would hope that you carry it over into the way that you work too. There is no such thing as a detail. A detail in a drawing is nothing more than a smaller shape. So when you think about making a picture, you think about going from larger to smaller, or from vast to isolated, meaning that you build everything out first and look at it all in context together, and then you focus on the smaller spaces and you build those in the same direction. You put them all together, then put mid-sized shapes, then medium shapes, then small shapes, then smaller shapes into those spaces, and that's how you build a picture. When we think of the word detail, our tendency is to go into a completely different mode of thinking, and we render our pictures in an entirely different way. And we don't want to think like that, because we still want the picture to feel like it all belongs together. So if our technique changes, that means we have to apply that technique everywhere for all over harmony, or the picture is going to feel like a bunch of patchwork pieces of different types of pictures that have all been assembled together. So that's my rant on details. So when I say the word detail, I hope in your mind the lexicon that you're building switches over to this new definition and says, oh, he meant smaller shape when he said detail, because he wasn't thinking about, when he said that word detail, that he had this rant on the first week. Anyway, all right, so these are the things that we're going to be looking at. Now, we have one more thing to look at here, and that is the mannequin. The mannequin is a simplified geometric and volumetric design tool, not figure, designed as a scaffold for the underdrawing of a more complete or rendered finish, or to an illustration or to a study, or whatever you want to do, even if it's just a little doodle. And the mannequin is a space container for all the information we're going to put in. To look at one, here are some of the basic shapes in the mannequin, or more importantly, the core of the mannequin is this, what I use as a pillow shape. Now, you could have seen other videos from my teachers and my students that say this is a bean. I had a few other teachers that said, think of it like a pillow, and that stuck with me. And that's the way I show this, is it's a pillow. And the corners of the pillow imply landmarks on the body. So it helps us sort of get things in the right space before we even know the exactness of those details. So this pillow, the four corners of the pillow, the two top corners and the two bottom corners represent bones, the acromion process and the great trochanter on the pillow form. The pillow, when we draw it, is this flexible, pliable thing that we would sleep with in our bed, that we can squish and bend and stretch in any direction we want, just so long as the pillow stays contained and connected together contextually from side to side and top to bottom. The pillow, it represents two major masses in the core of the body. It represents the rib cage and the pelvis. And then there's a spine, another hardened surface that connects the two together. Hardened but flexible. These three shapes together are contained within the pillow space, and we flatten out a lot more information than just the rib cage and the pelvis within the pillow shape. We get rid of all the muscles, and we also get rid of the scapula. We might see that as part of the contour, but we're going to get rid of it to simplify it down so that we can assemble it together with other shapes, which we'll talk about here in just a second, to create an illusion of a figure in space. Now, the lines that we put in might be altered because we didn't put them in the correct location, but once this mannequin is put in, this is the perfect place to start filling it with information. So what I'm kind of showing here is more about the landmarks and not so much, but these are bone shapes, and these bone shapes plus the muscles sit inside of these forms, and the muscles that we put on will breach the contour and create these curves that are linked back together with straighter lines in between them. Those straighter lines represent the bones and the tendons of the body that do all move together in the same direction. And that's this scaffold. So the scaffold represents bones. The boundary inside of here, for example, within the upper half of the thigh, is this great trochanter as well as the ischium on the pelvis. So we start at the ischium, move down to the side of the knee, start at the side of the great trochanter, move down to the side of the knee, the epicondyles on both sides, and then we move down to the ankles, the malleolus bones, and those bony landmarks design the width of this, what will eventually be, as we can see here with these contour lines, a cylinder form. And that cylinder form again represents the bones. So then we have